My presentation today is based on my thesis, which is Othering Affects How White Feminism Continues to Perpetuate Colonial Gazing. In this presentation, I will explore the questions I plan to answer, as well as outlining my overall thesis. From there, I will explore specifically moments when white feminists use the white colonial gaze in contemporary instances that perpetuates an ongoing colonial discourse within white feminism. To begin, there are several questions that I plan to answer in my thesis project. It is important to understand that my thesis is not to look for any solutions, but to simply acknowledge and critique the issues around the colonial white gaze. Several questions that I hope to answer with my thesis are one, what is the colonial gaze? Two, what is the history of the colonial gaze and how is that history still relevant today? Three, how has white feminism used the colonial gaze to expand the definition of other to all marginalized groups? And four, is white feminism working against marginalized groups for true equity and equality? Thesis statement. For my thesis, I will argue how white feminism continues to perpetuate the white colonial gaze through the practices and theories that continue to serve only a select few and not address the needs and inequality that many marginalized folks face. While my essay is not focusing on a suggested fix to the problem of white feminism perpetuating the colonial gaze, it will critique the problem and address the very root that is tied to the history of colonialism and the West. Outside the scope. The focus of my paper will be primarily on the white colonial gaze and how it affects BIPOC individuals, primarily in North America, but also within Western countries and contexts. However, the colonial gaze and white feminism often others marginalized groups that do not fit within the predominantly white middle class framework that many feminists link their positionality with. For that reason, for this presentation, while I will be discussing the white colonial gaze and its effects on BIPOC groups, I will also be moving outside the scope of the white colonial gaze and exploring how it affects other marginalized groups. Before we do that, however, we need to have some understanding of the gazes and how they interconnect. What is the colonial gaze? The colonial gaze is a broadly construed perspective that sets marginalized groups, primarily around race, as other. Through this gaze, the colonial agenda is maintained and legitimized by determining colonial realities and then dehumanizing any group that does not fit within the parameters of the colonizer archetype civilized, often white, heteronormative, etc. This identifies any group that does not fit into the archetype as other, colonized, savage, deviant. One of the most important tools a colonizer uses is to force the colonized to embrace a station within these colonial structures of power. While often viewed in relation to oppression of BIPOC people, the colonial gaze and how it works can be used to other any marginalized group who does not fit the white heteronormative binary. What is the white gaze? The white gaze is a system of looking where the human body is conceptualized and assumed to be white, cisgendered, heterosexual, able-bodied, and male. Any who fall outside of what that default archetype is othered. When we apply this to societal norms and structures, when one does not adhere to the white archetype, they face a multitude of challenges and systemic oppression. So how did they become interconnected? Interconnecting the white gaze and the colonial gaze is done very easily. Since both utilize practices of othering, they work together to create institutional and structural oppression that creates a lasting harm for marginalized people. Connecting feminism, specifically white feminism, to the colonial and white gazes, we look at privilege and power that many white feminists experience. White feminists often come from white middle class backgrounds that benefit from colonial and racist structures in place. However, they center themselves from a place of oppression, being female identifying, and can ignore the intersectionality of marginalized groups that are being further oppressed by white feminism and the behaviors of their allyship. Setting up the framework of understanding when solidarity creates othering. In this presentation, I will be focusing on different examples of how white feminists are continuing to perpetuate the white colonial gaze. This will also include a video that will explore a very clear example in 2017 of the white colonial gaze in play, and several feminist celebrities who, sometimes unknowingly, further the discourses set by the colonial gaze and model. The framework will look at 3 ways that white feminists perpetuate the white colonial gaze through behaviors that they commit. These are 1, tone policing, 2, centering, and 3, white savior complex. So why not just show serfs and turfs? Well, I can look at clear examples of serfs, sex worker exclusionary radical feminists, such as Kathleen Berry, and turfs, trans exclusionary radical feminists, such as J.K. Rowling, to illustrate moments when white feminists other marginalized groups in ways that show how the colonial gaze can be shifted onto other marginalized populations. I will not be looking at examples of either. The purpose of this thesis project is to look at how feminism still perpetuates this gaze within mainstream feminism and not in outlying groups. The white colonial gaze is insidious and can often appear in moments when white feminists' intentions are aligned to allyship, but because of ingrained structures of privilege, taint that allyship with the colonial gaze. This ties into something I will be covering later, where we say not us or not all feminists. If we just look at the outliers in the serfs and turfs, then we can say, well, we're not a serf or we're not a turf, so we are not committing any of these behaviors that continue to utilize that white colonial gaze. So the first way that we perpetuate the white colonial gaze is through tone policing. Tone policing creates that othering where the white speaker or white feminist is the civilized speaker in the room, while the marginalized speaker is the uncivilized or violent speaker. This is directly correlated with the white colonial gaze and how it is perpetuated in white feminist discourses. When tone policing is done, the focus is placed on the tone used by the speaker and not on what that person is saying. It is a form of silencing to avoid any topics that conflict with the white colonial gaze and continues to be used to disengage, derail, or completely silence the key issues of marginalized groups. It is also a way to set stereotypes such as the aggressive lesbian or the angry Black woman, which is a continuation of the white colonial gaze and white colonial violence. So our example of tone policing occurred in July of 2021 in the British Parliament when Victoria Atkins MP used tone policing to discredit Zara Sultana MP. At the time, Sultana was speaking out about comments that were made by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, where he referred to Black people as pickaninnies with watermelon smiles, and his mocking of Muslim women as letterboxes and bank robbers. Victoria Atkins MP has served as the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Women, and most recently as the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. She felt confident in her tone policing a woman of color who spoke calmly and with eloquence, commenting that Sultana was shouting at her. So we're going to watch this quick clip so that you can see examples of tone policing.
Gave the usual Tory platitudes. Yes, she condemned the horrific racism our England stars have faced. But what will she think about the Prime Minister when he was doing, when he was describing Black people as pickaninnies with watermelon smiles, when he used newspaper columns to mock Muslim women as letterboxes and bank robbers, when he refused to condemn the booing of England players taking the knee, and when his Home Secretary derided that anti-racist message as gesture politics? Isn't it the case Mr. Speaker, like England star Tyrone Mings has said, that the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister were stoking the fire of racism, giving the green light to racism, and only now, when the consequences are clear, are they feigning outrage.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I had hoped that we were going to be able to conduct this debate in a measured and collective way. I don't genuinely think the Honourable Lady is accusing either the Prime Minister of this country or indeed the Home Secretary of racism. That would be a truly extraordinary allegation to make. But I hope at some point we will be able to work together to tackle racism. That is what we all want to do. That is what the work of this government is directed towards. And I hope that we're able to just lower the tone a little bit and understand that again, she's trying to shout at me again, that in tackling these horrific instances of racism, we need to work collectively together. And shouting at me across the dispatch box is not going to help with that.
So as you can see, there's several instances where Atkins is using the language of tone policing. This could be we can see this when she says, we might be able to work together, as though Sultana is the one who is being unreasonable by voicing her concerns about the Prime Minister's comments, warranted concerns. Another example is lower the tone, and she's trying to shout at me. So again, it's framing herself as the civilized speaker, Sultana, who is a woman of color, as the uncivilized, the aggressive, the violent speaker. And again, this works to silence speakers, but silence anyone who is trying to bring forth an issue that needs to be addressed. It should be noted that Atkins has worked on many feminist initiatives within the parliament, including the initiative to fight against domestic violence. So she is not an outlier. She is a prominent feminist voice within England. She is conservative, yes, but she does have feminist leanings and does advocacy work within feminism. So we're in this example, we are seeing a white feminist use a tool of the white colonial gaze in silencing a woman of color. So white feminists often use tone policing to control discourses and to protect their privilege, which comes from the white colonial gaze, instead of understanding the structural oppression being addressed by a marginalized group or speaker. So in Atkins' case, she did not want to hear about Boris Johnson being racist, which his comments were very racist. And she was just talking about tone to avoid the discourse. So we're going back to the next type of way that the white colonial gaze is used in how we behave, how white feminists behave. And this comes down into centering, which is a very common thing. Centering is a very common way to shift the white colonial gaze back into place by the use of avoiding topics of othering. This can be seen with conversations of race, but it can also be shifted to conversation on trans rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and disability rights. Centering is done when white feminists shift the narrative to what they are feeling and not what is happening. Conversations become what is happening to them and not what is happening to the marginalized group. Centering is about reframing the white colonial gaze, and it explicitly dehumanizes anyone who does not fit that white colonial archetype. Furthermore, specifically to feminist issues, when centering occurs, it means that issues can only be understood when it is reframed through a white feminist lens, which only perpetuates the white colonial gaze. So we're looking at an example of centering. This comes from a series of tweets by Bette Midler, who is a longtime ally of LGBTQ plus rights and an active feminist. However, after Roe versus Wade was overturned, Midler took to the platform formerly known as Twitter to voice her disapproval, writing, "Women of the world, we are being stripped of our rights over our bodies, our lives, and even our name. They don't call us women anymore. They call us birthing people or menstruators, and even people with vaginas. Don't let them erase you. Every human on earth owes you." So this is clearly an example of Midler using the tactic of centering, where her plight is the default. When called out for her lack of support for female identifying folks who do not fit the white colonial archetype, particularly for trans people, gender non-binary, just any person who does not identify with that cis normative, heteronormative archetype of what a woman is. Midler, after she posted this and received some backlash for her post, Midler continued her centering by adding a connection to the white feminist savior. However, even in her defense of her tweets, she's still centering. So she further went on to say, "I fought for marginalized people for as long as I can still remember. Still, if you want to dismiss my 60 years of proven love and concern over a tweet that accidentally angered the very people." She finished this by saying, "And I have always supported and adored, so be it. But the truth is, democracy is slipping through our fingers. I'm all in on trying to save democracy for all people. We must unite because, in case you haven't been paying attention, divided we will fall." All of these are centering. Again, it's placing her as the center. She's the one being attacked, but she's the only one who can see reason because she's seeing democracy slipping through her fingers. It has the white savior complex, which we will discuss next, where she's talking about how she's fought for marginalized people for as long as I can remember. This is very important to look at the wording. "I've fought for marginalized people." Again, it centers her as the point of interest, not the issue, and it makes her a white savior. And she's not saying "I fought with." So she's very much playing into that, "Look at what I've done for you. I shouldn't be getting this backlash because I have fought for, not with." So she's using centering. She's using a tiny bit of tone policing because, she's calling people out for their anger, that she's the only one of reason, because she's always supported and adored. And then she's also using the white savior complex. And although we're not covering it, another one is spiritual bypassing, where you sidestep actual issues by talking about your own feelings or about your own enlightenment. So in Midler's final tweet, where she talks about how we need to unite, we need to wonder if it'll be marginalized groups leading the United Front, or do we assume the white colonial archetype through the white colonial gaze that affects everyone, whether they have privilege or not? So will it be Midler as a white woman who will be fighting, leading that united front, or will it actually be marginalized people who are feeling the effects of this loss of democracy? Which brings us to the white savior complex. In the corner, we have just a very quick one. It's a symptom of racism and white supremacy, which places those in a position of privilege into the role of savior over those who've been historically oppressed and exploited. So the white savior complex is linked to the idea of a white individual saving a racialized member of BIPOC groups. However, this white savior complex can be shifted to include the white able-bodied savior, the LGBTQ plus ally savior complex, and any savior role where a person of privilege is helping a marginalized, disadvantaged group by showcasing nice things they've done for the marginalized group, which we saw Midler doing. So the white savior complex is, in any context, is a continued perpetuation of the white colonial gaze. First, it others the marginalized group. Second, it weakens them through unsaid context that the marginalized group could not overcome without the white feminist. Third, it is a way for many white feminists to say that they aren't part of the problem. The case is not all men, or in this case, white feminists, because they are holding up their savior status to show the world that they are different and are lifted up and are lifting up marginalized groups instead of being a true ally, providing support to goals of marginalized groups while breaking down white colonial gazing and structures alongside them. This is not, they should be working as allies, not as a look at what I've done for you, but as an actual true ally who is standing beside them. So in this slide, you'll see examples of the white savior complex. A lot of it is tied to race in this slide, but again, you can see the white savior complex in a range of different issues, including disability issues and LGBTQ issues. So ever since the 80s and celebrities singing about saving Africa, we have seen the white savior complex in many examples. When Patricia Arquette called upon all the men who love women and all the gay people and people of color that we've all fought for to fight for us now, it was a glaring affirmation that the white colonial gaze is still very much maintained and perpetuated by white feminists. However, there are many other examples of white savior complex in our society, including movies depicting white saviors such as The Blind Side and The Help, which are at the right top of the screen. And then we also have celebrities posing with Black African children, such as Stacey Dooley, seen at the bottom right. And then Ed Sheeran here. And then, or white celebrities who have adopted disabled or BIPOC children, such as Madonna with right here, and Angelina Jolie. And then we have influencers who are a form of celebrity, such as Micah Stouffer, who adopted an autistic child from China. She was very public about her adoption process. She was very much signaling that she was a white savior. However, after a short period on her channel, she placed him with another family due to what she said was behavioral issues. This illustrates another problem deep-seated in the white colonialist gaze, that of dehumanizing any who do not fit the archetype and viewing marginalized people as something that can be thrown away or traded, but ultimately forgotten. While advocacy work can be a positive that starts from a good place, once it becomes self-serving, it begins to take on the very structure of the white colonial gaze. So we're going to end with one final video explaining how the white colonial gaze is perpetuated by white scholars and white feminist scholars. It is an excellent example of how privilege often leaves white feminists tone deaf to how their allyship is structured to serve the colonial power that continues to oppress others. In this video, it is a reaction video to an essay written by a Harvard professor, a white female Harvard professor, where she took a journey through Africa through Into the Heart of Darkness and Similarities through the Congo. And she continued perpetuating the white colonial gaze in her 3,000-word essay that was published by the New York Times. We'll watch the video now because a lot of what I would say has been said in the video, and she explores why perpetuating the white gaze, the white colonial gaze, is harmful for anyone.
Africa is not a country. It's not some black hole of poverty and danger for white people to prove how brave they are. It's happened again. Following in the tradition of Louise Linton and Joseph Conrad, another white person has written a quintessentially colonialist travelogue, recounting their courageous journey through dark and exotic Africa. But this time, it was published in the New York Times. It was written by a Harvard professor, and it's 2017. Here's the rundown. Maya Jasanoff is a history professor at Harvard. She's now working on a book about Joseph Conrad, author of the 1899 colonialist classic Heart of Darkness. She decided to reenact Conrad's boat trip down the Congo River. Unfortunately, Jasanoff's essay turned out to be a perfect example of what former Africa correspondent Howard French calls ooga booga journalism. She opens with a grotesque description of smoked monkeys impaled on a stick. Jasanoff also says the Belgian king Leopold II, who ruled over Congo until 1908, had a, quote, self-described mission of promoting progress and civilization, free trade, and the abolition of slavery. She concludes, quote, in relative terms, most people in Congo were better off 100 years ago. In reality, King Leopold oversaw a horrific genocide that killed at least 10 million people in a brutal forced labor system to extract rubber. The Congolese were abducted, mutilated, starved, their villages destroyed, all just to fill King Leopold's pockets. Somehow, Jasanoff boils down these atrocities to just a passing reference to, quote, greed, violence, and hypocrisy. To cap it off, Jasanoff's 3,000-word essay doesn't name a single Congolese person that she quotes. This is a prime example of the West's fascination with Africa, but not with the complexities of Africans themselves. Lazy media narratives painting Africa as a dark, diseased, and war-stricken place miss the vibrancy of the continent. It misses the progress that African nations have made economically and politically. Africans are perfectly capable of telling their own stories. Take the 2006 essay, How to Write About Africa, by Kenyan author Binyavanga Wanena. In the satire, he says, sarcastically, make sure you show how Africans eat things no other humans eat. Monkey brain is an African's cuisine of choice. What do you know? Jasanoff did exactly that. Lazy narratives about Africa can lead to lazy policy about Africa. And ultimately, continuing to look at Africa through a colonial, white savior viewpoint dehumanizes Africans. Jasanoff and the New York Times could have saved themselves from this wahala backlash if they had taken the time to listen to Africans, to understand that Joseph Conrad's colonial gaze should be left in the past where it belongs.
So as you can see, there's a lot of these illustrations of what we've gone through. There's the centering, where the author of the article situated herself in the center of this journey through dark Africa. You see the white savior complex, you see stereotypes at play, where just overall the white colonial gaze is still very much in place, and it does perpetuate a violence because it sets a narrative of what Africa is in the white colonial gaze and doesn't actually see Africa for the rich, vibrant continent filled with multiple, like a lot of countries that are diverse and have a wide range of progress, and a richness of culture and progress in ways that are progressive for their country and not for the white colonial gaze. The main point that I wanted to end with is when she said in the video, Africans are able to write their own stories about Africa. This can be extended to any marginalized group who are just as capable of writing their own stories. All that is needed for white feminists to do is to read those stories and to celebrate those stories and to stand with those marginalized groups, not work for them, not do the work for them, like Midler said, but to work with them in the capacity that that marginalized group needs them to work for them, which again should be dictated, should be led by the marginalized groups. If we do this, these stories will not only shift the white archetype to be something different, it will shatter the white colonial gaze, which brings us to my conclusion. So as you can see, if we work within the privilege of the white colonial gaze, we will continue to perpetuate it. To stop the cycle of oppression through the white colonial gaze, it is important for white feminists to see how they are perpetuating it, to see their privilege, their biases, and their own views of how equity is often through a white Western lens, where marginalized groups fit into the white colonial structures of our society. To make changes in our world and to break down the structures in place, we need to reset the archetype to one that is fluid, multidimensional, and 100% human, regardless of race, gender, disability, sexuality, etc. In other words, we need to change the default of human from white, cisgendered, heteronormative, heterosexual, gender binary, predominantly male, and shift it to encompass everyone. To close, as said, the master's tool is the tool of the white colonial gaze. And as Audre Lorde wrote, we will never dismantle it if we continue to use it. And here is a list of my references, and thank you for your time to present.